Welcome back to the David Pakman Show. I'm Benjamin Dixon filling in for David while he is away. Thanks for having me, David. Let's talk about some breaking news from last night. The Internal Revenue Service, this is according to the New York Times. The original reporting was done by the Washington Post. But here's a quote from the New York Times, quote, "The IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, has no choice but to honor congressional requests for President Trump's tax returns unless he invokes executive privilege to protect them, according to a draft legal memo written by agency staff members." Now, this is important because, as you recall, Steve Mnuchin's excuse for not turning over Donald Trump's tax returns to the committee in Congress that clearly has the legal right to obtain anyone's tax returns for that matter. Mnuchin basically said that they did not have the legislative purposes or legitimate legislative purposes. In fact, here's the quote saying, quote, "The memo appears to undercut the reasoning offered by Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin, who has refused to comply with the Democrats' requests because they lack a, quote, legitimate legislative purpose." Mr. Mnuchin said he made his decision after consulting with lawyers from the Treasury Department, the IRS, and the Justice Department. Now, here's why this matters. He's claiming that he spoke to lawyers at the IRS. And here's a draft that has surfaced, a draft memo that has surfaced that was written last fall, according to the Washington Post. It was never signed and never an official memo. And they're already giving a disclaimer saying that this particular memo did not reach the desk of Steve Mnuchin. However, if Steve actually consulted with the IRS attorneys, it's very likely they would have come to the same conclusion, or it's very likely that they had access to that draft memo. And so this claim that he spoke, that he's making this decision to not turn over the president's tax returns based on consulting the IRS attorneys doesn't really hold a lot of water, right? It does become a he said, she said kind of gossipy type of thing. But the bottom line is this: we're dealing with an administration that has no regard for checks and balances. And not only are we dealing with the president, I make the distinction of an administration because it's clear that President Trump has no respect for checks and balances. He believes that he ought to be a dictator, that he has the right to circumvent Congress, and that he has the authority and the ability to use his bully pulpit to get his way. That's one thing, but it becomes extreme. It becomes even more dangerous when you have collaborators that are inside of all the different agencies, because that's truly how a dictatorship is actually implemented. That's how authoritarianism actually is brought to us. It's not just by one demagogic leader like Donald Trump. It's by those people throughout the layers of administration who are complicit, like Steve Mnuchin, like anyone who is bucking against these requests from Congress. You have the Attorney General, you have others who are ignoring subpoenas, refusing to testify before Congress. I mean, they're literally looking at the checks and balances system of our nation and basically saying just to hell with it, right? There's no regard for it. And that is extremely dangerous. But that is where we have been for some time. One of the things I remember most, and you probably remember the same, immediately after the election of Donald Trump, people went on this tirade, this tour rather, saying to not let this become the new normal, or this can't become the new normal. But the reality of it, this is the new normal. And unless we figure out how to adjust and to address this new normal, Donald Trump will continue to get away with the things that he gets away with. And it does not help that we have Democratic leadership, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, who are timid on using the power of impeachment, right? That is literally their tool to put a person who has no regard for the Constitution in check. Donald Trump has zero regard for our norms, our institutions, but most importantly, the Constitution of the United States. And we have Democratic leadership who are afraid to actually do what they have to do to protect our democracy, such as it is. That is where the danger really lies. We have an authoritarian style dictator at the top, wannabe dictator at the top. You have people throughout the bureaucracies who are complicit either with their silence or their active collaborators with the president. And then you have an opposition party who doesn't want to play opposition, or at least you have leadership in the opposition party who simply do not want to fight back. This is the perfect recipe for a dictatorship, a full dictatorship, for authoritarianism. And Donald Trump is exactly the man to do it. As you can recall, you may not recall, but there was a video of supporters of Donald Trump. And one of them literally said, and if I could find the clip, I'll play it, but you can Google it. One of them literally said, I never thought that I would want a dictator. But if we do have a dictator, I want it to be Donald Trump. So we have all of the converging forces necessary to usher in a dictatorship. And I'm not saying that in terms of scare tactics or hyperbole. We literally have the one system that can place a check on the president of the United States refusing to do so. While you have the president of the United States, his collaborators, and those who are simply complicit with their silence, ignoring the law, circumventing the law, ignoring subpoenas, circumventing subpoenas. And now we have a document from the IRS that states that the president has to turn over his tax returns to Congress. And we have the leader of that department. We have Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury, who's saying, well, I talked to them, but we came to the conclusion that Congress had no legitimate legislative purpose in requesting these documents from the President of the United States. Collaborators, we have people who are complicit, either tacitly or directly, and we have an opposition party led by two Democrats, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, who refuse to use their power to place a check on this president who is clearly out of control.